I remember the blood, the knife, the feeling of power as I held it in my hand. These chilling words would later escape the lips of a man whose acts would haunt the community forever. In a quiet town in South Carolina, an unsuspecting man shared a drink with another, only to fall victim to a savage, brutal attack in the woods. This wasn't just a murder. It was an embodiment of hatred, a violent outburst that came from deep, dark places, a place where a life is worth less than a fleeting moment of power. But what happened next is even more disturbing. A body left abandoned, hidden under the cover of brush. A murderer who reveled in his crime and later recounted it as if he were telling a tale of conquest. It's a crime so grotesque that words barely do it justice. And when you learn the full story, you'll be left wondering how such violence could ever come from someone so close to ordinary life. Viewer discretion is advised. What you're about to hear is deeply disturbing, and we don't take this lightly. But understanding these dark stories is the only way to help prevent them in the future. So be warned, this isn't for the faint of heart. Before we dive into this shocking tale, I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you tuning in today. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. For those of you who have been with us, your support means the world. Thank you for helping spread awareness of these cases through your likes, shares, and comments. Without you, our work wouldn't reach as far. Your contributions are not just appreciated, they are what make this channel possible. Now let's get into the dark reality of one of the most chilling cases we've covered yet. Number 1. David Adam Pate. The blade sank into Ricky James's flesh with the same cold precision that David Adam Pate described in his confession. In a moment, the woods outside Lancaster, South Carolina, became the site of one of the most chilling acts of violence the small community would ever know. A shared drink, a brief conversation, and then the murder. 39 brutal stabs, no remorse, no hesitation. Just a man consumed by a hatred so deep, he found pleasure in ending another's life. Born in 1988, David Adam Pate's life was one of quiet violence, a simmering rage growing in the shadows of his early years. Raised in Lancaster, South Carolina, David came from a family where lawlessness seemed to be both a legacy and a necessity. His mother, a single parent, struggled to provide, leaving David often to fend for himself. His early years weren't marked by love, but by neglect in an unstable home environment. School was a battleground where David's anger took root, and it wasn't long before his behavior began to reflect the simmering chaos at home. As a child, Pate exhibited troubling signs of aggression. He was often in trouble with teachers and peers alike, with violent outbursts that were brushed off as typical rebellious behavior. But for David, the anger never seemed to fade. It only grew stronger, more toxic. By his teenage years, his tattoos, including one of Satan across his face, were the first signs of his growing affiliation with white supremacist ideologies. His body became a canvas for hatred, with the number 974 inked on his neck, an indicator of his alignment with a violent, racist gang. This wasn't just rebellion against authority. It was a path leading him into deeper darkness. By the time he turned 18, Pate had already accumulated a criminal record, marked by convictions for burglary. He was released from prison with a chip on his shoulder, a hardened individual who had internalized a belief system that justified violence and hatred. His social environment only fueled these beliefs, pushing him toward a life of bitterness and isolation. October 2013 was a month like any other for David Pate, at least on the surface. But beneath the everyday monotony, the internal storm was raging. He was restless, angry, drunk on his own discontent. That day, he crossed paths with Ricky James, a man with no idea of the terror that awaited him. The two shared a drink in the woods near Pate's home, each unaware that the meeting would soon turn deadly. What drove David Pate to commit the murder was more than just a random outburst. It was a culmination of years of simmering rage and hatred. His violent tendencies, fed by his supremacist views and history of violent behavior, led him to a premeditated act of terror. There was no argument, no significant provocation, just a momentary lapse of control as he pulled out a knife and repeatedly stabbed James 39 times. His later confession was devoid of emotion, almost as though he was recounting a mundane event. "I just pulled the knife out and stuck it on him," he coldly described, with no sign of remorse. His desire wasn't just to kill, it was to inflict pain, to dominate, and to feel powerful. The investigation into Ricky James's murder began with the discovery of his decomposing body a month later. The case was quickly handed over to local law enforcement, but the breakthrough came when DNA evidence linked Pate directly to the scene. What followed was a chilling chain of events: an arrest, a confession, and a deeper look into Pate's psyche. During his police interview, Pate was remarkably calm, almost as though discussing an ordinary incident. He showed no signs of remorse for his actions, even shifting the blame to the victim. Why would anyone go drinking and go into the woods with someone who looked like him? His sense of guilt was non-existent. Instead, he rationalized his crime as the victim's fault for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The defense argued that Pate had confessed and was willing to take responsibility for his crime, but his lack of emotional depth and his chilling portrayal of the murder as a moment of power led the prosecution to push for the maximum sentence. The court found Pate's crime to be senseless and emotionless. In a final act of justice, Circuit Court Judge sentenced David Adam Pate to life in prison without the possibility of parole, deeming his crime to be remorseless. The impact of Pate's crime on the Lancaster community was profound. What had once been a quiet town was now shaken by the violence that had unfolded just outside their doorsteps. The brutal murder of Ricky James and the subsequent investigation revealed the deep undercurrents of hatred and violence that Pate had harbored for years. For Pate, the aftermath has been far less tumultuous. He is serving his sentence in a South Carolina prison, still a cold figure of unrepentant violence. He has spent over a decade behind bars with no chance of ever seeing freedom again. As of May 2025, he remains in prison, serving his life sentence for a crime that continues to haunt those who knew Ricky James. For the community and the family left behind, the case has been a reminder of how deep-seated hatred can fester in the most unexpected places. The scars of that day will never heal, as the town is left grappling with the brutal reality that someone they might have passed on the street was capable of such cold violence. Number 2. Joshua Amburgy. The knife was already in his hand, the blade gleaming in the dimly lit room. Joshua Amburgy's mother, Melissa Amburgy, was still alive when he first attacked her, but by the time law enforcement arrived, she was gone. Her life stolen by the very son who was supposed to care for her. The chaos that followed would shock not only their family, but also the small community that had long known Joshua as a troubled young man. Joshua Amburgy's story began in the quiet suburbs of Miami Township, Ohio. Born into a family where mental health struggles were never discussed openly, Joshua's early life seemed relatively normal. But behind closed doors, the cracks were forming. His father, a man who worked long hours in a demanding job, was often absent, leaving Joshua and his mother to navigate life on their own. From a young age, Joshua exhibited signs of emotional instability. He was often described as quiet and withdrawn, and although his father tried to maintain a disciplined environment, his emotional needs were neglected. This neglect, coupled with the strained relationship between his parents, likely laid the groundwork for the deep anger Joshua would later display. By his late teens, Joshua's mental health issues became more apparent. Struggling with severe anxiety and feelings of alienation, he found solace in video games and online communities, retreating further into isolation. Despite attempts to get therapy, he resisted help, unable to confront the emotional turmoil building within him. His behavior became erratic. He would lash out at his mother, often over minor issues, displaying aggression that went unnoticed by many. It wasn't just the isolation or the emotional struggles that set the stage for Joshua's crime. His family's dynamics, his mother's constant battle to support him while dealing with her own personal issues, left her in a vulnerable position, unable to fully address the signs of her son's growing volatility. November 1st, 2022, started as an ordinary day. Joshua had been living at home with his parents, struggling with his mental health and not yet receiving proper treatment. His mother, Melissa, had been concerned about his increasing mood swings, but didn't know how to get him the help he so desperately needed. She had tried to engage him, offer support, but her attempts were often met with resistance and anger. That afternoon, Melissa was hanging some artwork with her husband when Joshua repeatedly asked her to come upstairs. She refused, unwilling to indulge his growing demands. What happened next is a blur of rage. Joshua descended into the basement, grabbed a kitchen knife, and attacked his mother without warning. The first strike was brutal, but it didn't stop there. He continued to stab her, 7 times in total, until her lifeless body slumped to the ground. When his father intervened, trying to protect his wife, Joshua lashed out at him too. In a desperate bid to save Melissa, he used a chair to defend himself, but it was too late. Joshua fled the scene, leaving behind a trail of blood and horror. Joshua's crime was discovered quickly, thanks to a neighbor who heard the commotion and alerted authorities. When law enforcement arrived, they found Melissa Amburgy gravely injured, her son nowhere in sight. Joshua's behavior during the investigation was chilling. He had fled the scene, but the trail was clear. He was the prime suspect. Police soon apprehended Joshua in the backyard of a nearby house. He didn't resist arrest but was visibly agitated. His lack of remorse during questioning was disturbing. When asked about the crime, Joshua seemed detached, speaking coldly about the act as though it were nothing more than a minor altercation gone wrong. During the investigation, Joshua's psychological state was examined. The evaluation revealed deep-seated emotional issues, including a history of violent outbursts and anxiety. However, it was clear that these struggles weren't enough to explain away the brutality of his actions. In court, the defense argued that Joshua's mental health issues were a contributing factor to the murder. They pleaded for leniency, citing his emotional instability and lack of proper treatment. But the prosecution painted a different picture, a picture of a man who had been planning this violence for weeks. They highlighted Joshua's lack of remorse and his chilling behavior, both before and after the crime. Ultimately, Joshua was convicted of aggravated murder and felonious assault. The court sentenced him to 41 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving the minimum sentence. His emotional detachment and refusal to show any remorse during the trial only reinforced the prosecution's case. Joshua Amburgy's crimes shocked his family, his community, and even those who had only heard of him. For Melissa's family, the loss was unbearable. They couldn't fathom that someone they loved could commit such an atrocious act. His mother had been his most vocal supporter, yet it was her life he took in an uncontrollable fit of rage. The media quickly picked up the story, but it was the community that felt the deepest impact. Those who had known Joshua growing up could hardly recognize the man he had become. The tragedy served as a painful reminder of the consequences of untreated mental illness and the silent struggles that can build to a breaking point. As of 2025, Joshua Amburgy remains incarcerated at Claremont County Jail, where he awaits the chance for parole. However, even after serving over 2 years in prison, his future remains uncertain. His story is one of lost potential, broken relationships, and an unaddressed mental health crisis that culminated in the most tragic of outcomes. Whether Joshua will ever find redemption or truly understand the gravity of his crime is still to be seen. Number 3. Joseph Tuba. The knife plunged into Hanan Shahin's throat as she struggled to breathe, her life slipping away in a matter of moments. Joseph Tuba had been consumed by delusions, his mind clouded by paranoia, and in an uncontrollable fit of rage, he ended the life of the very woman who had once trusted him. The house was quiet afterward, but for the man who had committed the unthinkable, a quiet, unfeeling calmness took over. He'd done it, and now nothing would be the same. Joseph Tuba was born in 1985 in a small town on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio. Raised in a modest home, his early years were marked by a chaotic family life. His father, a man of few words, had a history of alcoholism and emotional instability, while his mother, though loving, struggled to control the turbulence within the household. As a child, Joseph was exposed to emotional neglect and unpredictable outbursts, which left a mark on his psyche. Growing up, Joseph was withdrawn, often quiet and isolated from his peers. His social interactions were minimal, and while his classmates thought little of him, Joseph's internal world was filled with turmoil. He battled feelings of inadequacy and distrust, and though his family tried to encourage a normal life, his mental health issues began to surface in his teenage years. Joseph exhibited signs of severe paranoia, and by his late teens, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. However, his illness went largely untreated for many years. Despite attempts to work through his mental health struggles, Joseph became increasingly delusional. He was often convinced that people were plotting against him and would withdraw from situations where he felt uncomfortable or threatened. In his late 20s, he was arrested for minor offenses, including theft and assault, but each time, the charges were dismissed or reduced. His legal history suggested an underlying pattern of unresolved mental health issues, problems that would escalate unnoticed until the tragic event that would forever alter his life. Joseph's life seemed to spiral as he grew older, and by the time he met Hanan Shaheen, a 27-year-old woman who had moved into the neighborhood, his paranoia was more pronounced. Hanan, a kind-hearted woman with no idea of the storm brewing beneath Joseph's outward calm, welcomed him into her life. The relationship that followed was marked by intense emotional swings. Joseph would show moments of affection, only to turn cold and distant the next. Hanan had no idea that beneath the surface, Joseph's mind was already inching toward the inevitable, a violent outburst. March 13, 2023, began like any other day for Joseph. His paranoia had been building, his fears mounting that the people around him were conspiring against him. The voices in his head grew louder, and that day they led him to believe that Hanan, the woman he had trusted, was part of the very plot against him. His mind twisted the smallest of incidents into signs of betrayal, something that, in reality, was nothing but ordinary behavior. By the time Hanan returned from running errands that afternoon, Joseph was on edge. His mind raced, his thoughts fragmented, and in a fit of rage he lashed out. Hanan, confused by his erratic behavior, tried to talk to him, but Joseph couldn't hear her. His mind was consumed by an irrational fear, and when she reached out to him in an attempt to calm the situation, he saw it as a threat. Without warning, Joseph grabbed a kitchen knife, his hands shaking from the weight of his delusions. He stabbed Hanan once, and then again. She tried to fight back, but the more she struggled, the deeper the knife went. In less than a minute, the woman who had offered him kindness was dead. As he stood over her lifeless body, there was no immediate recognition of the horror he had just committed. Only the eerie silence that filled the room. Joseph's crime was discovered only hours later when Hanan's neighbors, who had heard the commotion, called the police. Officers arrived at the house to find the scene of carnage. Hanan's body still warm, her blood staining the floor. Joseph, however, was nowhere to be found. Authorities quickly launched a manhunt, knowing that this was no ordinary crime. The investigation revealed Joseph's history of mental health issues, as well as his growing paranoia in the weeks leading up to the murder. When Joseph was arrested later that evening, his behavior was unsettlingly calm. He didn't resist, didn't show emotion. During questioning, he offered no immediate remorse. When asked why he killed Hanan, he simply responded that she was part of the conspiracy against him. His delusions were clear in his responses, but his lack of remorse was even more disturbing. Psychological evaluations were conducted, and it was revealed that Joseph's schizophrenia had escalated in recent months. His inability to distinguish between reality and his delusions had led to the tragic killing. The defense argued that Joseph's mental state at the time of the murder rendered him incapable of understanding the full scope of his actions, pushing for a sentence based on mental health rehabilitation rather than traditional punishment. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They emphasized the brutality of the act, noting Joseph's ability to plan and carry out the murder, even if driven by delusions. They argued that the violence was premeditated and that Joseph's history of unaddressed mental illness had led to a breaking point. The jury convicted him of second-degree murder, and Joseph was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 25 years. Joseph Tuba's crime sent shockwaves through the community. His neighbors, who had seen him as a quiet, harmless individual, were left stunned by the brutality of the act. The murder of Hanan Shaheen, a woman who had been nothing but kind to Joseph, left many grappling with the dangers of untreated mental illness and the need for more comprehensive mental health care in communities. For Hanan's family, the loss was devastating. They struggled with the fact that she had been taken by someone she had welcomed into her life. The case sparked a wider conversation about the importance of addressing mental health issues before they escalate into something far more dangerous. As of 2025, Joseph remains incarcerated at Cuyahoga County Jail, where he has undergone several psychiatric evaluations. His legal team is currently working on a petition for his parole eligibility to be reconsidered, citing his ongoing therapy and progress in rehabilitation. However, the future remains uncertain. Joseph's story is a tragic reminder of how untreated mental illness can destroy lives, even when the warning signs were there all along. Number 4. Timothy Ray Jones, Jr. The image of 5 lifeless children sprawled across the back of a car in a remote area of Alabama will forever haunt the memory of those who uncovered the gruesome scene. Timothy Ray Jones, Jr. had killed his children, one by one, before he set their bodies adrift like discarded objects, his face emotionless as he recounted the horror in cold, clinical terms. The father of 5 had gone from loving dad to ruthless killer in the span of just a few days. Timothy Ray Jones, Jr. was born in 1980 in Richland, Mississippi, to a middle-class family. On the surface, his early years seemed relatively ordinary, marked by the typical struggles of a child growing up in the South. However, Timothy's family life was far from stable. Raised by a mother who had her own emotional issues and a father who was largely absent due to work, Timothy was left to fend for himself, experiencing the neglect and emotional void that would leave lasting scars. As a teenager, Timothy struggled with school and social relationships. He was shy, introverted, and often found himself on the outside of the typical teenage social scene. His parents, though they tried their best, were unable to offer the emotional support he needed. By the time he entered his 20s, Timothy had already faced several run-ins with the law, ranging from petty theft to more serious charges, including driving under the influence. These early brushes with the law were warning signs that Timothy's emotional issues were deepening. At age 21, Timothy enlisted in the U.S. Army, seeking structure and discipline. His military career, however, would only highlight his struggles with authority and control. He served a brief, uneventful stint before he left, disillusioned and angry, a man still searching for direction. By the time Timothy married Naomi Jones in the early 2000s, he was already battling severe emotional problems. His marriage would be a tumultuous one, marked by domestic violence, emotional manipulation, and infidelity. In 2008, the couple separated after years of conflict, and in 2009, they divorced. During the course of their marriage, Timothy was often described as unpredictable and volatile. His relationship with his children was marked by both tenderness and control, but as time went on, his mental state deteriorated. August 28, 2014, was the day that would forever change the course of Timothy Ray Jones Jr.'s life. At the time, Timothy was struggling to cope with the breakdown of his marriage, his strained relationship with his children, and his growing inability to manage his emotions. He had also been drinking heavily in the days leading up to the crime. On that fateful day, Timothy drove his 5 children, Mara, Elena, Nadia, Gabriel, and Micaiah, from their home in South Carolina to his house in Mississippi. Their mother had reported the children missing after they failed to return home, but it was already too late. Timothy's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and at some point during the drive, his rage boiled over. It's unclear exactly what set him off, but his mental state had been deteriorating rapidly in the weeks prior. Timothy's own testimony later revealed that he had been angry with his children for a variety of trivial reasons, but his actions became more violent when he decided to execute them one by one. The details are horrific. He strangled each child, suffocated them with a plastic bag, and left their bodies in the back of his SUV. After killing them, he drove to Alabama, where he dumped their bodies in a remote field. The discovery of the bodies was nothing short of devastating. Authorities launched a nationwide search when the children were reported missing, but the trail would lead investigators to Timothy after a tip-off from a concerned individual who had noticed his erratic behavior. The murder investigation quickly turned into a case about a father's unthinkable actions, and the search for the children's remains would lead authorities to a rural Alabama field. Timothy was arrested without incident on September 6, 2014, and his behavior during his arrest and questioning was unnerving. When questioned, He showed no real remorse for the murders. In fact, his cold indifference to the gravity of his actions seemed to unsettle investigators even more. He described the murders in a matter-of-fact tone, offering chilling details about how he killed each of his children and left them discarded, as though they were nothing more than pieces of trash. By 2017, Muhammad had been living with his mother, Nada Haran, in a modest apartment in Chicago. The two had an incredibly complicated relationship. While his mother supported him financially, her control over his life was oppressive, and their emotional ties were strained. She often criticized him, belittled his choices, and expressed disappointment in his inability to succeed in the eyes of others. These interactions, though subtle, slowly pushed Muhammad to the brink. On the morning of August 21, 2017, an argument erupted between mother and son. This time, it wasn't just a fight about his lack of progress in life. It was an emotional eruption. Muhammad, already on edge from months of frustration and anxiety, snapped. His anger, which had been brewing for years, finally boiled over. He struck her, his hands closing around her throat. As she gasped for air, her pleas went unheard in the deafening rage of her son. The very hands that had been raised to comfort her in her weaker moments now silenced her completely. In a moment of clarity, Muhammad realized what he had done, but his actions were driven by a cold rationality. This was the only way to escape her suffocating grip on his life. He then wrapped her body in a towel, trying to erase all evidence of the crime. His attempt to cover up the murder seemed almost clinical, as though he had practiced this moment in his mind. His world, shattered by years of anger, now had only one stark reality. His mother was gone. The murder of Nada Haran was discovered when concerned neighbors, who hadn't seen the pair for days, called the authorities. When the police arrived, they found a scene that was unsettlingly calm. Nada's body, carefully wrapped, as though her death had been planned. Muhammad, however, was not as composed. His behavior during the investigation raised red flags immediately. He appeared detached, speaking in a flat tone when questioned, offering little information but clearly trying to avoid suspicion. The police soon connected the dots. Muhammad's history of emotional instability, coupled with his strained relationship with his mother, led them to consider him the prime suspect. Psychological evaluations confirmed that Muhammad had long struggled with severe depression and anger management issues, which only intensified after he moved in with his mother. In court, Muhammad's defense argued that he had killed his mother in a moment of extreme emotional distress, claiming that years of psychological abuse had pushed him to the breaking point. They painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by his mother's control, unable to cope with the pressures of his life. However, the prosecution contended that Muhammad had carefully planned and executed the murder. His lack of remorse, combined with his calm demeanor during questioning, painted a picture of a man who had finally acted on years of pent-up anger and resentment. After several days of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The murder of Nada Haran sent ripples through the community. For those who knew Muhammad, the crime was difficult to comprehend. How could the man they had known as quiet, withdrawn, and seemingly harmless be capable of such brutality? The tragedy not only shattered the family, but also raised questions about the long-term effects of emotional neglect and psychological strain within families. For Muhammad, the aftermath was marked by an eerie sense of detachment. In prison, he was noted to exhibit an emotional disconnect from his crime, a coldness that worried even his fellow inmates. His mother's death for him seemed to close a chapter on a lifetime of inner turmoil. But it was also a sentence he would now serve in solitude. As of 2025, Muhammad remains incarcerated in a medium-security prison in Illinois. He is eligible for parole in 2027, though it is unclear whether he will ever gain the emotional insight or remorse that would allow him to be released. His story serves as a chilling reminder of how emotional isolation, unresolved psychological issues, and toxic family dynamics can lead to horrific consequences. Number 5. Adrien Oswaldo Sura Reyes. Adrien Oswaldo Sura Reyes was born in 1994 in Los Angeles, California, to immigrant parents from El Salvador. His childhood, though not devoid of love, was heavily marked by the strain of financial instability and cultural isolation. His parents, working long hours in low-wage jobs, were often too exhausted to provide the emotional support Adrien desperately needed. Raised in a neighborhood where gang activity was common, he spent much of his youth navigating an environment rife with violence, drugs, and a lack of opportunities. From an early age, Adrien struggled to fit in. His peers bullied him for his accents, his awkward demeanor, and his apparent inability to connect with others. This social isolation, paired with a lack of guidance at home, began to take a toll on his mental health. Adrien began to withdraw further into himself, using video games and online forums as an escape from the harsh reality of his environment. But the world inside his mind wasn't peaceful. Adrien's thoughts began to twist and distort, influenced by the toxic elements of the neighborhood he grew up in. Over the years, he adopted conspiracy theories and delusions about being watched, about people plotting against him. Though his family was unaware of the full extent of his mental state, signs of his deteriorating mental health were evident. His behavior became erratic, and his temper flared unpredictably. In his late teens, Adrien began experimenting with drugs, which only fueled his paranoia and anger. His mental health deteriorated rapidly, and by the time he reached his 20s, he had begun showing more outward signs of severe schizophrenia. Yet he never sought help. The darkness in his mind grew unchecked. On August 13, 2022, Adrien's world finally snapped. For weeks, he had been increasingly agitated, convinced that people were following him, conspiring against him. He heard voices, delusional whispers telling him that he was the only one who could stop the Great Conspiracy. His paranoia reached a fever pitch, and that afternoon he grabbed his car keys, determined to carry out whatever mission his mind had constructed. Adrien's rampage began in a bar parking lot where he ran over a woman, Claire Knights, with his car. Her death was horrific, the impact instant. Yet it was only the beginning. Panicked by the growing chaos in his head, Adrien didn't stop there. He then drove the car toward a crowd of bystanders, running over several more people. His mind, clouded by delusions, seemed indifferent to the violence, as though it was a necessary part of his warped reality. After the carnage, Adrien drove off, his mind still consumed by the belief that he was part of some greater mission. He abandoned his vehicle a short distance away, leaving behind destruction and confusion. As he wandered through the streets, his delusions kept him detached from reality, unaware of the devastation he had caused. The police investigation into Adrien's actions began almost immediately after the incident. Witnesses described the chaotic scene, giving police a description of the vehicle, which led to Adrien's swift capture. When arrested, he was calm, almost eerily so. He didn't resist, offering no explanation for the events that had just unfolded. It wasn't until later during questioning that his delusions began to surface. He claimed that he was doing his part to stop the plot, but his explanations were incoherent and disconnected from reality. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Adrien was suffering from severe schizophrenia and delusional disorder. His inability to distinguish reality from his own fantasies had led him to commit the violent act. Yet his mental state made it unclear whether he fully understood the consequences of his actions. Despite this, the court determined that Adrien was competent to stand trial. In the courtroom, the defense argued that Adrien's mental illness was the driving force behind his actions. They painted a picture of a man who had been unable to control his impulses due to his paranoid delusions. However, the prosecution focused on the severity of the crime, emphasizing the premeditated nature of the event. They argued that Adrien's actions weren't entirely the result of his mental health issues, but rather a violent outburst driven by both his psychosis and deep-seated anger. The jury ultimately convicted Adrien of 2 counts of second-degree murder and multiple counts of attempted murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, recognizing both the violence of his actions and his need for long-term psychiatric care. Adrien's crime sent shockwaves through the community. The sight of random people being struck by a car, followed by the shocking realization that the perpetrator was someone with serious mental health issues, left many grappling with the complexities of mental illness and violence. The victims' families were devastated, especially Claire Knight's family, who struggled with the brutality of her death and the senselessness of it all. For the community, the aftermath sparked widespread conversations about mental illness, the failure of systems meant to provide care, and the need for better support for people like Adrien. The incident highlighted the dangers of untreated mental illness and the potential for violence when those struggles are ignored. As of 2025, Adrien remains incarcerated in a psychiatric prison where he is receiving treatment for his schizophrenia. He is still haunted by the delusions that led him to commit the murders, though it remains unclear whether he will ever gain insight into the full scope of his actions. His case serves as a grim reminder of how untreated mental health issues can lead to horrific outcomes and leave behind an irreversible trail of destruction. Number 6. Curtis Michael Algier. The sound of gunfire echoed through the parking lot, cutting through the night air like a harsh, unforgiving scream. Curtis Michael Algier, a man with a history of violence, was in the midst of an escape attempt, one that would cost the life of a Utah Department of Corrections officer. Stephen Anderson lay dying on the cold asphalt, his final moments marked by an abrupt, senseless death. Curtis didn't hesitate. The murder was part of his plan, part of the chaos he had long anticipated. It wasn't just an escape. It was a culmination of years of violent impulses and an unyielding drive to break free, no matter the cost. Curtis Michael Algier was born in 1984 in Salt Lake City, Utah, into a world already steeped in dysfunction. Raised in a home where the echoes of broken relationships and neglect resonated, Curtis was exposed to an environment that lacked emotional stability. His father, a truck driver, was often away, while his mother struggled with substance abuse, leaving Curtis largely to his own devices. His early life was filled with neglect, and by the time he reached adolescence, his emotional instability became more apparent. From a young age, Curtis displayed behavior that was far from typical. He was frequently in trouble at school, often getting into fights, stealing, and acting out in ways that made him a target for bullying. His father's absence left a significant void, and Curtis's unresolved anger began to fester. With few positive influences and no real emotional support, he gravitated towards negative social circles, those who shared his penchant for rebellion and violence. As Curtis entered his teenage years, his encounters with the law became more frequent. Petty theft, assault, and vandalism marked the beginning of his criminal career. By 18, Curtis was already incarcerated for a string of burglaries, but it was the prison system that would mold him into the man he became. Behind bars, Curtis's anger grew, and his violent tendencies were nurtured by a culture of aggression and revenge. He was quickly labeled as a troublemaker, and the longer he spent in prison, the deeper he sank into a life of crime. Though there were some brief moments when he tried to turn his life around, they were fleeting. Curtis's life seemed to be governed by a simple, brutal philosophy: survival by any means necessary. It was this mindset that would push him to commit one of the most notorious acts of violence in Utah's recent history. By 2007, Curtis had been serving a prison sentence for armed robbery and assault. He had already attempted multiple escapes, and his violent behavior inside the prison walls had made him a target for both guards and fellow inmates. Curtis had come to believe that freedom was a birthright, something that could only be achieved by breaking the chains, no matter who got hurt in the process. On the night of October 17, 2007, Curtis saw his opportunity. He had carefully planned his escape for months, observing the routines of guards and finding weaknesses in the system. When his chance came, he seized it with deadly precision. Using a stolen weapon, Curtis shot Officer Stephen Anderson during an escape attempt. Officer Anderson, a man known for his dedication and courage, had been trying to prevent Curtis's escape, but his efforts were in vain. Curtis's violence didn't stop with the shooting. He continued to evade the authorities, leading them on a high-speed chase through Utah's winding roads. The entire situation escalated quickly. What began as a desperate attempt at freedom turned into a violent spree that left Officer Anderson dead and Curtis on the run. The investigation into Officer Anderson's murder quickly pointed to Curtis. Authorities were able to trace the trajectory of his escape, and soon a manhunt was launched. Curtis, however, remained elusive for several days. When he was finally apprehended, his calm demeanor struck investigators as particularly chilling. Curtis offered no resistance when he was captured, but his silence was enough to send a shiver through the officers who had been chasing him for days. During his interrogation, Curtis showed no remorse for killing Officer Anderson. Instead, he appeared almost detached, explaining the events in a way that suggested he viewed the murder as a necessary step in his escape. "It was just part of the plan," he said, his tone cold and unfeeling. His lack of guilt further reinforced the prosecution's case that he was a man capable of ruthless violence without hesitation. Psychological evaluations revealed that Curtis had been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and there were indications that his violent tendencies had been building for years. However, the question of whether he was fully aware of the consequences of his actions remained at the forefront during the trial. The defense attempted to argue that Curtis's upbringing, his time in prison, and his untreated mental health issues played a significant role in his violent outbursts. They painted a picture of a man driven to madness by a life of neglect and abuse. The prosecution, however, maintained that Curtis was fully aware of his actions and had executed his escape plan with deliberate intent. In the end, the jury found Curtis guilty of first-degree murder and escape from custody. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that was met with mixed reactions. While many believed it was a just punishment for his brutal crime, others wondered if Curtis could ever be rehabilitated given his profound emotional and psychological issues. The murder of Officer Stephen Anderson and the violent escape that followed left a deep scar on the Utah community. Officer Anderson had been a respected member of the force, and his death was felt by his colleagues, his family, and the public. The case also prompted a larger discussion about the conditions within the prison system and the treatment of inmates with severe mental health issues. Curtis's crime did not just affect his victim's family, but also left the prison system grappling with how to handle individuals like him, those whose capacity for violence and disregard for human life had led them to commit heinous acts. His lack of remorse and his chilling demeanor during his arrest only deepened the fear that Curtis was beyond redemption. As of 2025, Curtis remains incarcerated at the Utah State Prison, serving his life sentence. He has shown no indication of remorse, and his mental health remains a topic of ongoing debate. His story continues to serve as a grim reminder of the potential for violence in those who are untreated and left to fester in the shadows of their own minds. Number 7. Chad Christopher Dorman. The sound of gunshots pierced the quiet of a suburban home as Chad Christopher Dorman methodically executed his 3 children, ages 7, 4, and 3. The walls of their home, once filled with the sounds of laughter and the innocence of childhood, were now stained with blood. The calm that followed the violence was almost as chilling as the crime itself. Doerman, after murdering his children, sat down, quietly contemplating the irreversible act he had just committed. Chad Christopher Dorman was born in 1983, growing up in a suburban neighborhood in Monroe Township, Ohio. On the surface, his family appeared to be like any other: working-class parents, a quiet home, and the promise of a better future. However, beneath the facade, there were cracks in the foundation of Chad's life. Raised by a mother who was emotionally distant and a father who struggled with anger and emotional instability, Chad grew up in an environment that could not properly nurture his emotional and psychological needs. His childhood was marked by neglect and exposure to violence. From an early age, Chad exhibited troubling signs. He was quick to anger, impulsive, and lacked the emotional coping mechanisms that most children learn from stable family environments. In school, Chad was often in trouble, struggling to connect with his peers. His grades were poor, and his social life was non-existent. By his teenage years, Chad had already been in trouble with the law on several occasions, mostly for minor offenses like vandalism and theft. However, it was his violent outbursts, often directed at family members, that foreshadowed the dark path he would eventually follow. As Chad grew older, he married and started a family. He had 3 children with his wife, Tiffany Doerman, and despite his troubled past, he tried to maintain the image of a father who cared for his children. However, the cracks in his psyche deepened. He felt increasingly overwhelmed by his responsibilities and resentful of his wife, who was often frustrated with his inability to provide stability and emotional support. His relationship with Tiffany grew increasingly strained as his rage continued to build. The foundation for Gavin's later actions began to take shape in his teenage years. His parents, though caring, were not equipped to deal with the subtle signs of distress Gavin exhibited. By his late teens, Gavin's increasingly erratic behavior raised concerns, especially his growing fixation on celebrities. particularly female TV personalities. He would obsess over interviews, studying their movements and expressions, as if he could somehow connect with them in a way he couldn't with real people. As Gavin entered his 20s, his life became consumed by one obsession after another. His time spent in front of screens grew more and more extreme, and he immersed himself in online communities where he found people who, like him, fixated on others. The boundary between the virtual world and reality blurred, and Gavin began to view his fantasies as something more tangible, something achievable. He had attempted relationships before, but they were always short-lived, leaving him frustrated and alienated. These failed attempts at normalcy only deepened his sense of inadequacy, and the more he withdrew from the real world, the more he focused on the object of his desire, Holly Willoughby, a well-known TV host. She represented everything Gavin felt he could never have: attention, affection, success. And the more he obsessed over her, the more his fixation grew to dangerous levels. By August 2022, Gavin had fully committed to a plan that had been simmering in his mind for months. He believed Holly Willoughby was the key to his salvation, a person he could possess in a way that would make him feel validated, seen, and most importantly, in control. In the weeks leading up to the event, Gavin's behavior became more erratic. His interactions with his family grew more strained, and he became secretive, spending hours alone in his room, meticulously planning every detail of his scheme. He had even gone so far as to gather materials, including surveillance equipment and other tools, to carry out the kidnapping. But the plan initially to capture her for a fantasy he believed he could control evolved into something darker. On the day of the crime, Gavin set his plan into motion. He had been following Holly's movements online, tracking her schedule, and knowing when she would be filming her show. But something snapped within him that afternoon. His thoughts shifted from fantasy to violence. As he prepared to carry out his kidnapping, he thought only of his obsessive need to possess her, not realizing that the lines between his delusions and reality had long since disappeared. Gavin's plan did not unfold as he intended. What began as a carefully constructed scheme to capture Holly transformed into an uncontrollable rage. He couldn't take her, so he tried to claim a piece of her, but in his state of heightened obsession, that claim turned deadly. In his disturbed state, the idea of ownership became intertwined with violence. He couldn't control his desire anymore, and the act escalated, leaving devastation in his wake. The police were alerted when Holly Willoughby, after missing an appearance, was found safe. But the investigation revealed the depth of Gavin's obsession. Investigators pieced together the details of his plan through the evidence found in his home: surveillance equipment, detailed notes, and social media posts that had given clues about his intent. When authorities brought Gavin in for questioning, he initially seemed compliant, almost eerily calm. As they pieced together the timeline of events, Gavin's disjointed answers began to reveal the full extent of his delusions. During interviews, Gavin spoke about Holly with a sense of entitlement, convinced that he was meant to be with her. His emotional detachment and inability to grasp the severity of his actions made it clear that he wasn't just a man driven by obsession, he was consumed by it. Psychiatrists concluded that Gavin suffered from obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, and delusional disorder, conditions that had been exacerbated by his social isolation and unhealthy fixations. While the defense argued that Gavin's mental illness played a significant role in the crime, the prosecution painted a damning picture of a man who was fully aware of his actions, but chose to ignore the line between fantasy and reality. The court convicted Gavin of attempted kidnapping, stalking, and assault. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with a possibility for parole after 20 years. During the trial, his demeanor remained unnervingly calm, showing little remorse for his actions. His fixation on Holly had blinded him to the fact that he had hurt real people, not just characters in a story he had created in his mind. The aftermath of Gavin Plum's crime sent ripples through the media. The public, shocked by the extent of his obsession and the violence it triggered, struggled to understand how a man could spiral into such dangerous territory. The case raised unsettling questions about the power of social media and the internet to fuel dangerous fantasies and fixations. For Holly Willoughby, the impact was deeply personal. Though she was unharmed physically, The psychological toll of the event would linger for years. Her fans and family, who had always seen her as a beloved figure, were horrified by the lengths to which Gavin had gone. In interviews following the case, Holly expressed gratitude for the support she received but admitted that the ordeal left a lasting impact on her sense of safety and trust. As of 2025, Gavin Plum remains incarcerated at a high-security facility where he has undergone several psychiatric evaluations and has been placed in a treatment program for his mental health. His story remains one of obsession spiraling out of control, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked mental illness and the terrifying outcomes that can arise when boundaries between reality and fantasy are blurred. Number 9. Joseph Farado. The sharp crack of a gunshot echoed through the quiet, rural campsite as Joseph Farado stood over his wife, Emily Jean Farado, pointing the gun at her head. His eyes, cold and devoid of emotion, flicked over her body once, as though checking his work. Emily fell back, lifeless, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the world seemed to stop around Joseph. He had done it, he had murdered his wife, but nothing in his face betrayed the gravity of the action. There was no remorse, no horror, only a man lost in a cold delusion that had been years in the making. Joseph Farado's story began in 1989, when he was born in a small town in Ohio. The Farado family, though not wealthy, had all the trappings of middle-class normalcy. His father, a construction worker, was a strict but present figure, while his mother, a schoolteacher, was warm but often overwhelmed with the demands of her job. The home life was stable, but it was also emotionally distant, with little nurturing between Joseph and his parents. From an early age, Joseph exhibited traits that hinted at a deeper turmoil. He struggled to connect with his peers and was often described as quiet and withdrawn. Despite his mother's attempts to encourage him to pursue friendships, Joseph gravitated toward isolation. He spent most of his time lost in books, video games, and later online forums. He became obsessed with the idea of control, something that seemed to elude him in every aspect of his life. Though his early years weren't marked by outright violence, Joseph's personality was defined by an underlying sense of frustration and anger. He wasn't able to express these feelings adequately, often internalizing them and letting them fester. In high school, his few friends noted how intense and brooding he could become, particularly when things didn't go as planned. He seemed to retreat further into himself after a few failed relationships, especially with his romantic partner, who left him unexpectedly during his senior year. As he grew older, Joseph's inability to cope with failure only worsened. He enlisted in the military, hoping the discipline would help him, but it only deepened his emotional instability. After leaving the service, Joseph returned to Ohio where he met Emily Jean Farado, a woman he described as the love of his life. They married quickly, but beneath the surface, Joseph's insecurities and possessiveness began to show. Emily had a bright future ahead of her, but she found herself slowly suffocating under Joseph's increasing control. He isolated her from friends and family, constantly demanding attention and becoming enraged when things didn't go his way. There were moments when Joseph showed flashes of charm, but his darker nature was always lurking just beneath the surface. His anger was unpredictable, often triggered by small things, and in moments of intense stress, it would erupt without warning. The day of October 16th, 2021, began like any other, a road trip to celebrate their anniversary. Emily and Joseph had been on the road for hours, and despite the picturesque backdrop of the Ozarks in Arkansas, tension simmered beneath the surface. Joseph had been growing more controlling in the weeks leading up to the trip, and Emily had become increasingly frustrated. She had planned to speak with him about seeking help for their troubled relationship, but there was a weight in her chest that told her something was terribly wrong. By the time they arrived at the campsite near the lake, the argument had already begun. The fight started small, Emily asking Joseph to relax, to enjoy the day. But it escalated quickly. Joseph accused her of being too independent and not respecting him enough. His voice rose, his hands clenched into fists, and Emily, fearing the inevitable, tried to walk away to calm herself, but Joseph followed her. That's when the gun came out. The argument that had started as a verbal altercation turned into something much darker. Joseph, consumed by his rage, snapped. The details of the crime are chilling. He shot Emily once in the head, and then a second time in the chest to ensure she was dead. He stood over her for a moment, silent, before walking back to the campsite, leaving her lifeless body behind. Emily's family reported her missing after she failed to return their calls and didn't arrive back from the trip. Police began their search immediately, focusing on the last place Emily and Joseph were seen. It wasn't long before they found her body, discarded at the campsite, covered partially with a tarp. Joseph, who had returned home alone, acted nonchalant when questioned by authorities. His demeanor was disturbingly calm, almost as if he were discussing an inconvenient detail rather than a brutal murder. During interrogation, Joseph claimed that Emily had simply left him, and he had no idea where she went. However, the inconsistencies in his story, combined with the evidence at the scene, soon led investigators to question him further. When confronted with the evidence, his fingerprints on the weapon, his phone records placing him near the campsite, Joseph's confession came not with tears, but with an eerie sense of detachment. "She didn't listen to me," he said flatly. "I did what I had to do." Psychiatrists who evaluated Joseph noted the deep-seated narcissism and obsessive tendencies that had characterized his behavior for years. He had no history of violent crime, but had shown signs of emotional instability, which had been exacerbated by the loss of control he felt in his relationship with Emily. At trial, the defense attempted to argue that Joseph's mental state at the time of the murder had been compromised, suggesting he was not fully aware of his actions due to his emotional distress. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture, focusing on the premeditated nature of the crime. The evidence of his anger and control over Emily in the days leading up to her death painted a grim picture of a man who had planned the murder with chilling efficiency. The jury convicted Joseph of first-degree murder, and the court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The murder of Emily Joan Farado shocked not only her family and friends, but the entire community. Those who had known Joseph were stunned. How could the quiet man they had known for so long be capable of such brutality? His family, too, was left reeling, unable to reconcile the man they had once known with the murderer he had become. For Emily's family, the grief was overwhelming. Her parents, who had been hoping for her happiness in her marriage, now had to face the harsh reality that their daughter had died at the hands of the man she had loved. The public reaction to the case was intense, and media coverage of the trial kept the details of the case in the public eye for weeks. As of 2025, Joseph Farado remains incarcerated, serving his sentence at Arkansas State Penitentiary. Reports suggest that he has shown little remorse for his actions, and he continues to blame Emily for the breakdown of their relationship. Psychological evaluations continue to explore the full extent of his emotional issues, but there are no signs that Joseph will ever gain insight into the magnitude of his crime. As we reflect on the tragic stories of these individuals, each driven by their own inner turmoil, unchecked emotions, and deep-seated struggles, we are reminded of the importance of recognizing the signs of mental health issues and the devastating consequences that can occur when those struggles go untreated. These cases are not just about crime. They are about lives lost, families shattered, and communities forever impacted. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health challenges, don't wait. Reach out for help. The support, understanding, and guidance that can make a difference are out there. Don't let another story like this unfold. Thank you for joining us in exploring these stories. If you found this content thought-provoking, unsettling, or eye-opening, we invite you to like, share, and comment. Your engagement helps spread awareness and encourages important conversations about mental health, violence prevention, and how we can all work together to support those in need. Subscribe to stay informed as we continue to bring these stories to light, providing in-depth looks at cases that can sometimes be overlooked, but never forgotten. Let's continue to learn, share, and make a difference together.